Welcome everybody to the June meeting of the Financial Literacy Club. As you've seen in maybe the displays and saw in the email, we have a very, very special guest today. It's Gerri Walsh. She is the president of the Financial Industry Regulatory Agency Investor Education Foundation. It's a mouthful. FINRA Foundation for short, and also a vice president of FINRA itself. She has a very long and impressive resume. In this role, she is responsible for the foundation's strategic initiatives in educating and protecting investors. She's also the founding executive sponsor of FINRA's Military Community Employee Resource Group. Of course, we have a lot of people here who are former military. She represents FINRA on the FTC, their Scams Against Older Adults Advisory Group. She represents them on a lot of things. I could go on for a while. And before joining FINRA in 2006, she was with the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. She was their deputy director of the, again, Office of Investor Education and Assistance. Before that, she was special counsel to the director of that office. And she's also been a senior attorney in the SEC's Division of Enforcement, where she prosecutes people like the Wolf of Wall Street, or prosecuted, past tense. She got her career start in private practice as an associate with Hogan Lovells, right down in DC. Her JD is from the NYU School of Law. Her BA, magna cum laude, is from Amherst College, and she is also a member of the New York and DC bars. Please welcome Gerri Walsh. So I'm going to be asking Gerri a series of questions, a little interview stuff, but I want you guys to know that we are going to have an audience Q&A portion towards the end. We'll just see how the timing works out, but ideally, we'd like to give you guys maybe in the range of 10 minutes, but we'll just see how it goes. So please be thinking of questions and be aware. I will remind you again. I'll try to remember to remind you when that time comes that we are doing a recording. So, if you speak out loud, you are consenting to having yourself captured by that, your voice. You won't be on camera. If you don't consent to that for any reason, we'll have a little piece of paper and a pen where you can write down your question, and I'll just ask it that way. Okay, Gerri, love to start off by talking about kind of your career path, how you got to where you are and where you are now. So as I said, you started your career in private practice before you moved to the SEC. Can you tell us about what you did in private practice and what made you decide to make the move to the government side?
So I started in private practice. I'm going to back up a little bit because I am the daughter of immigrants, and my parents didn't go to college. My sister and I, among the first in my family to go to undergrad, and I'm the first and until recently only person in my family to go to grad school. So I was a little bit naive about career choices in the U.S. And I thought I would go to law school because I wanted to help people. And I ended up with a mountain of debt. And I don't know how relevant that is to folks who are here. But student debt is real. And even almost 40 years ago, when I graduated from college, it was real then too. And the rates were 12 and 9%. So pretty horrific. So after I graduated from law school, I actually decided in my first year of law school that I didn't want to stay, but I had to because the only way I was going to make enough money to pay back my loans was to become a lawyer. And so I went into private practice, basically to pay off my loans. And after about 4.5 years, I did. And I had done a lot of networking to find out what people liked about the jobs that they were doing. I was doing product liability defense litigation. And honestly, it was representing a large national car company. And there were some times where litigation was definitely plaintiffs' lawyers taking advantage of big corporate deep pockets. But I started having nightmares about the the people that were injured in these car crashes. And that was when I was like, I have got to get out of this. I have got to get out of the treadmill that I'm on. And so that was why I looked for opportunities elsewhere. And friends of mine who worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission loved the investigative work that they were doing in the Department of Enforcement. And it didn't combine some of the uglier aspects of corporate litigation. So I know far more about the biomechanics of automobile crashes. If you ever want to talk about that, don't talk to me because I had nightmares. But that's how I ended up at the SEC, honestly, was I wanted an off-ramp from private law practice doing something that was in the public service.
You felt much more passionate about that side of things.
Much more, much more. And the truth is, even before I went to law school, I took a year off and I was working for my college in the Office of Admission. And I was deciding between a career in education or a career in law when I naively went to law school and incurred all that debt. And so I wondered while I was at the SEC, how can I combine those two passions? I have this legal background. I can do it. I'm good at it, but how can I apply it for public service and combine my passion for education? And that was where kind of taking a step off the beaten path for lawyers by leaving the enforcement division to go work in the Office of Investor Education was the perfect right step for me.
That's beautiful. And I will also let you know, there's a lot of people here who are familiar with student debt.
Yes, yes, yes. And whatever you decide to do now, it doesn't mean that's what you're going to be doing 10 years from now, right? It's not a life sentence. It's just a life choice.
So after you worked for the SEC for over a decade, you made the shift over to FINRA. You joined their investor education group, even though you were already doing investor education with SEC. What made you decide to make that leap?
Part of it was that, so it was NASD at the time, National Association of Securities Dealer, but then it merged into, with the regulatory functions of the New York Stock Exchange to become FINRA. But so I call it the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, but back in the day, it was actually a different name. But I did it largely because, NASD at the time, FINRA, had made a huge commitment in terms of funding for investor education programs. And so a government agency can only do so much, and government agencies can do great things when it comes to public service. But having fine money from enforcement actions that NASD, FINRA have taken over the years really allowed the FINRA Foundation to do more and to partner with other entities. So partnering on research, partnering on outreach, partnering on training opportunities. And so to me, it seemed like a logical next best step to go over to FINRA because I was going to be able to do more in the communities that I wanted to serve.
Now, since we're talking about FINRA, which I think I said at the beginning for anyone who has walked in since then, stands for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Can you tell us about what FINRA does, what its mission is?
Sure. Its mission is investor protection and market integrity. And we are a not-for-profit, non-governmental regulator of the securities industry, but one important slice of the securities industry, the member brokerage firms and the individual brokers who sell stocks, bonds, mutual funds, et cetera, in the United States. So we're overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the place I used to work. And we exist because Congress back in 1939 amended the law that gave birth to the Securities and Exchange Commission in order to allow for this self-regulatory model of regulation within the securities industry. So a number of industries have self-regulatory bodies. We're empowered by Congress to basically police the brokerage industry. And more recently, following the Madoff situation in 2008 and the passage of Dodd-Frank in 2010, which was the response to the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the SEC has been more focused on the investment advisory business freeing up FINRA to really take more of a leading role with the brokerage industry. So we create rules, which the SEC approves. And there's a whole public rulemaking process where, advocates for industry, advocates for investors, advocates for technology can weigh in, right? There's some rules that might have an impact on consumer financial privacy, right? And so we'll have the ACLU, groups that you wouldn't think of as being involved in the securities industry, weighing in on the privacy aspects of rules that we're about to pass. But we enforce those rules. We examine firms, we register firms and the brokers, the individual brokers. In order to be a broker, you have to be sponsored by a firm, you have to pass exams, licensing exams, and then you have to undergo continuing education and constant inspection by us. And so it's a pretty rigorously surveilled industry. And that's really in a nutshell what we do. But a core piece of what we believe is important for investor protection is, this investor education.
How much of a challenge, this is not one of my prepared questions, but how much of a challenge do you feel like that is getting contact with people? Because I constantly hear people saying to me that they want to learn about all these kinds of topics and they don't even know what to do and where to turn. But you're out there looking for them in turn.
Right. And my team is 12 people strong. So we cannot boil the ocean, and we know that. But that's why through the foundation, we're able to work with partners who have trust in their communities. And so, we work with an array of organizations from AARP to United Way Worldwide, because they've got built-in audiences who trust them and who believe in them and who will accept messages. So we know we can't reach every individual, but what we try to do is work with organizations that do. And we work all the time with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then I'm also that person who I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I do believe that, the face-to-face interaction is something that can be very powerful. And so when it works, I try to come and speak to people for real.
And here we are.
Here we are.
You mentioned a moment ago that FINRA was the successor to the National Association of Securities Dealers. Can you talk to us about kind of why this reorganization happened, if that's the right word for it?
Yeah, a lot of the exchanges that are out there, so exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, they're a different kind of self-regulatory organization under the rubric that the securities laws establish. So they are the platforms for trading. And FINRA is a standalone type of SRO, self-regulatory organization. And what was happening in the early 2000s is all these markets were becoming demutualized. They had been mutual associations. They were not-for-profit organizations, self-governing, but they were becoming for-profit platforms. There's nothing wrong with for-profit platforms. There's nothing wrong with for-profit companies, right? But it was becoming apparent to the Securities and Exchange Commission, to Congress, that there was a conflict of interest with profit centers being the exchange platforms. And so what was happening is NASD at the time was entering into regulatory supervisory agreements with a number of the exchanges to take over some of the regulatory surveillance work. So FINRA, a lot of people don't realize this, but we're a massive technology company because we take in a ton of data from all these market centers. Every single order that gets placed to buy, to sell, if there's any parameters on it, that all gets brought into FINRA. We're processing, excuse me, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of pieces of data a day. And so anyway, the New York Stock Exchange, as it was one of the last to demutualize, it sold off, basically it spun off its regulatory and enforcement functions. And so it was that merger of the existing NASD Back in the day, NASD owned the NASDAQ stock market before the
That's where
NASDAQ.
name comes from.
That's where the name comes from, right? So it was the NASD automatic quotation system. That's what NASDAQ stands for.
And just very quickly, you said you get every order. If I were to place a limit order that never gets filled, would that be included, or is it only transactions that complete?
No, it's all the transactions, and for every transaction that completes, there can be dozens.
Tons, I'm
Right,
sure.
right. I mean, there's this whole spillover effect.
So you hate the Flash Boys, basically. They're just making you buy extra servers. For those who don't know, The Flash Boys is a book by Michael Lewis about high frequency traders who put in tons of orders that would never execute, among other topics.
And as a regulator, I can't recommend any particular product, professional, or strategy, including flash trading or non-flash trading. But we're actually in the cloud. And that was something FINRA had made a number of investments in the kind of the late first decade, right? So 2008, 9, 10 into 11, 12 into data centers. But we realized pretty quickly that we needed to be in the cloud with the way the markets were evolving and the use of technology dominating. We needed to be in the cloud, and it was really a leap of faith for a financial regulator to go into the cloud because many of the institutions that we were overseeing were not themselves in the cloud. But after a bidding process, we worked with Amazon Web Services to kind of create this cloud-based market surveillance system. That's why we have so many technologists on board at FINRA. There's 4,200 employees, only 12 do investor education, but there's something like 1,500, upwards of 2,000 who sort of support the market surveillance function. Because remember, I said investor protection, market integrity. If you have markets where people are able to spoof orders and not get caught, placing orders, to drive down prices or engage in market manipulation, that's something we need to cut off. And that's what we do all the time. A lot of the actions that we take are sort of technical violations by firms or by conglomerates who are engaging in manipulative trading practices.
Now, we haven't said this directly. Also, it must be Amazon who hates the Flash Boys in that case.
I
You
can
don't
say
care.
nothing. That's right.
So we've kind of alluded to this. You're not a government agency, but you are formally authorized by Congress. Can you talk to us about what the relationship is between FINRA and USG?
So the US government oversees us, and we are, if Congress wants to ask us to come and testify about a certain action, like back in 2008, FINRA people were brought in to testify about what was happening during the financial crisis when Lehman Brothers folded. I mean, there have been a lot of episodes that have brought us there. So we like any entity have to testify as needed. But there are a couple of dimensions of our relationship with the United States government. One is that we are overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So on the one hand, we're doing the broker-dealer surveillance, but it's under the watchful eye of the SEC. And in fact, we are the only self-regulatory organization that has an office within the SEC that has our name in it. There's this entity called FISIO, the FINRA Securities Industry Oversight Office within the Department of Examination. So we are very heavily regulated ourselves in our regulation of the securities industry. But we also, again, with this technology element in mind, we run a platform called BrokerCheck. And if you remember nothing else from today, remember BrokerCheck. We'll talk about it some more. But it's basically this central registration depository, CRD. We believe in a lot of acronyms at FINRA. But the states and the Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA use it so that we're able to monitor registered investment professionals more broadly than the brokerage industry. So that's involvement with the SEC and with states. We often make referrals to state securities regulators and to the SEC and or the FBI, if we see criminal activity happening, we don't have criminal authority. The SEC, notwithstanding Wolf of Wall Street and what was that movie with Gordon Gekko? Wall
I
Street.
think it was Wall Street.
I think it was Wall Street, right? Yeah, they don't carry guns at the SEC and they don't have criminal authority at the SEC. And I know because I used to work there. But, you know, we do make referrals when we see something that we don't have jurisdiction over. And then another way that we have an interface with the US government is actually with Treasury. Because so a lot of people think that the stock market is the big ticket in the United States, but the bond market, right? Bigger. It used depending on sort of valuations, it's bigger by a large margin or bigger by just a little bit. But treasuries are a big component of the bond market. And so the US Treasury has turned to FINRA to help create some transparency in the various treasury securities that it markets and sells to the public through a platform called Trace. It's a trade reporting and compliance engine, TRACE. But there's now Trace for treasuries. So we are a service provider, we are a partner in investigations, and we are ourselves regulated.
I'm going to ask you a question that I was saving for dessert, but since you mentioned the we don't carry guns and things like that, I will ask you this question now. Can you share with us a recent, or maybe not recent, anecdote about a wrongdoer who was busted by FINRA or the SEC and found guilty of a financial crime?
Yes, I can. There was a gentleman, I believe his name was Troy Loudon, and he recently pleaded guilty to insider trading. He's going to have to pay $1.7 million in, it's called disgorgement, which is such a strange word. It almost sounds like vomiting. And the idea is that you have to cough up your ill-gotten gains. And so he has to, right. So he has to cough up 1.7 in ill-gotten gains. And I believe he's facing up to 5 years in prison for insider trading. And basically what happened was, as part of its market surveillance that I was telling you about, and I know I talked about market manipulation, we have a very robust insider trading surveillance mechanism. There's a team of people who monitor major transactions. And so this gentleman was married to a woman who was part of the mergers and acquisitions department at BP, the gas station. And BP apparently bought some travel center. I think that was the name of the company actually. They were merging into BP. So you know how when you go to a rest stop, there's often a little convenience store, right? So it was this merger of the petroleum company and the travel center facilities. And this woman was apparently, she told her husband, you know, that we're buying Travel Center, and he bought Travel Center stock. And then, of course, when the merger, or BP stock, I can't remember which one it was, but when the merger happened, the stock price went up by 70%. He made a ton of money. But then this woman was, you know, she was one of the people who was working on the deal, and she was complaining, or there was somebody else who was complaining to this woman about the scope of FINRA's inquiries about the transactions that were happening on this deal, because, you know, we can tell what's happening and we can get information from the publicly traded companies. Who are your employees who are working on this deal? Who is the investment banking firm that's underwriting, if it's an offering of securities, or who's the corporate team who's doing the due diligence on the transaction? Like, we can get all that information. And, this woman was complaining about how awful FINRA's investigation was. We made a referral to the SEC and to the FBI, but we were continuing to assist in the investigation. So the SEC took civil charges, hence the $1.7 million disgorgement, and the FBI is bringing criminal charges against this gentleman. But basically, someone complaining about the breadth of our investigation was what led this woman to tell her husband about, like, wow, you know, that deal I was telling you about, FINRA is really hot on the trail of the insider traders. And he fessed up. So he probably would have been worse off if he hadn't come forward.
Sure.
But yeah, so that's just one example,
One of many, I'm sure.
one of many. Yeah.
So something like this, a merger happens or a breakup, public becomes aware of it today, it's happening this week. But you ever like learn of something that's like, I got the cloud data from 3 months back, a year back. You start running and my algorithms and see if any funny things happen ahead of time. And you start targeting people that could have benefited. Like you had your AI engines and all going into it.
Well, I don't know that it was AI engines, but I do know that it was, because we actually, like, it's interesting that you mentioned artificial intelligence, and I promised that I would touch on this. We're not actually allowed to use artificial intelligence as like explorative, AI. However, we are constantly running algorithms and we have massive amounts of data. Massive amounts of data. And so we're able to get all the training data, and there are different regulatory tools. We have to follow all the channels. We can't just say, I think someone's suspicious, I want to take a look at them. We have to have a regulatory purpose. But when there is that kind of merger and there's unusual trading leading up to that merger, we're able to go back and say, all right, you traded in the weeks and months ahead of this public announcement, because the whole idea, the whole principle of our markets is that it should be a level playing field, right? Everybody gets information at the same time. And that's why a lot of people are required to sign confidentiality agreements. And I'm sure in the work that you do, you know all about confidentiality agreements, and you know about the potential misuse of large data sets.
And just out of curiosity, you said there was 1.7 million. Was that 100% of the ill-gotten gains, or was that a portion of it, or was that more?
I don't know. I assume that it was all of the ill-gotten gains, because it's pretty, like, you can tell how much they traded for and then how much they sold for.
Right. At least as far as you know,
right,
that's what they made.
Right.
Okay. Now, we said right off the bat that you wear two hats. You are a senior vice president of FINRA and the president of the FINRA Foundation, Investor Education Foundation. Can you tell us about the difference between these roles and the relationship between the organizations?
Right. And it truly is wearing two hats. Most of the people on my team wear two hats, but FINRA Investor Education has long been a department that sort of is a public face. So like all the content that is on finra.org/investors, which is unbiased information, basically gives you what you need to know about investing, questions to ask, resources to turn to for unbiased information. We manage all that information. We also, some of the things that I represent FINRA on, it's sort of, it's a way of cultivating key stakeholders, right? Like there's a robust financial literacy crowd, and basically you're out if you're not in it, right? And so I represent FINRA to sort of build those relationships, and on the international stage as well as on the domestic stage. But through the we advocate for investors. So one of the things that my office does is there's a lot of input, since we are a self-regulatory organization. FINRA is a membership organization. Now, the interesting thing is if you want to do business in the United States as a broker-dealer, you are required by law to be a member of FINRA. But it's kind of like the FDIC. They pay dues. They pay dues, they pay transaction fees, they pay registration fees. So like large firms that have 15,000 employees are going to be paying substantially more than a small, it's you and me, Daniel, right? Like it's just the two of us running a broker-dealer. So there's all kinds of, assessments on industry and levies for the use of services that go into funding our mission. So unlike the SEC, which is funded by an appropriation from Congress, we're not. We're completely funded by, the levies and the assessments that industry pays. We do assess fines on industry. They are capped by rules. And so we don't budget for fines, but we can use fines for things like capital improvement, like moving to the Amazon cloud. That was a big use of fine money. And a massive use of fine money has always been doing investor education program that go more broadly, and that's what the foundation does. So we have kind of the front facing of FINRA, sort of that, retail consumer focus on FINRA. But my team really works a little bit harder, deeper, wider to try to help people build wealth and then protect that wealth. That's really our whole mission. And so we work with a lot of organizations, particularly in workplaces, public libraries, to help build capacity within the field. So we can't reach everybody through those types of organizations, but the people that we train do. And on the investor protection front, we work with the National White Collar Crime Center to train local law enforcement to understand that if somebody comes to them saying that their money got taken in some kind of investment scam, whether it involves a penny stock or a crypto investment, but that isn't the civil matter that law enforcement has long considered it to be. It's a crime. And they really need to think about investigating it as a crime or bringing it to the attention of federal authorities, whether it's the local FBI office or the Securities and Exchange Commission, FINRA. I mean, we take a no wrong door approach when it comes to if people are concerned about what's happening with their investments, we make sure they get to a witness.
That's always very appreciated.
Thank you.
Very easy to call up and with some sort of concern, not to your organization, but to another one and
Yeah,
get the runaround
Yeah.
very much. So
Yeah.
we don't deal with that in this office kind of thing.
yeah, yeah.
Also, Gerri mentioned the brokered check. So for folks who have been coming to the meetings regularly, we did take a look at that sometime earlier this year. I think I actually looked up Jordan Belfort as an example to show people what they should be doing when looking at a fiduciary.
Yep.
So if you're curious about that, go back and check the meeting on that. Now, last question that's kind of about your career, before we get into some other topics. I did see that you previously served on the advisory board for the Stanford Center on Longevity. Very curious, can you tell us kind of about what this organization does and what your involvement with them was?
So we had a long, strong relationship and still have a good relationship with Stanford Center on Longevity. We actually helped them get started looking at financial fraud because they were looking at very pillars of a long, healthy life. And Laura Karstensen, who's a PhD psychology professor there, just felt very committed to making sure that as people approach retirement and old age, they have sound bodies, sound minds, and financial stability. And so we worked with them. They were very interested in standing up a financial fraud research center. And we wanted to understand how people become targets and ultimately lose money in these investment fraud schemes. So we did a lot of work on that and a lot of work on the psychological triggers. It boils down to being in an emotional state. And one of the things that we see frequently, especially with the ability to trade on your phone, right? It's frictionless, it's easy, and it's even addictive, right? It's a little bit like social media. That's because there are literally chemicals in your brain and body that are firing away, kind of encouraging you to stay glued to your phone and stay trading. That kind of emotional state is what can cause you to make a suboptimal decision. And so whether it's a happy state, like you love the confetti, or it's a sad state, you recently lost a spouse or a loved one, being in that emotional zone when you're making a decision with your money can cause you to lose money. And so we had a fantastic run, but then they just decided they were moving more toward the sound mind, sound body element rather than the financial stability. So it was a parting of friends. We still hang out together a lot, but we really we produced some good research that's been useful in the fraud prevention field, and it carries forward through today.
That's tremendous, and I can tell you, that resonates with me. My father has been guilty of clicking on text messages that he receives, and I have figuratively whipped him into shape at this point to stop doing that and contact me anytime, but it's a reminder that that is very easy, and for someone who doesn't have someone like myself to tell them otherwise, they may do that.
Yeah, and you know, how we talk to our parents, how we talk to our friends who lose money in these scams can be the difference between them actually being willing to talk to authorities. So it's really important in a non-judgmental, non-emotional moment, to sort of, find out what happened, because we, for better or for worse, in social media, it's like the first offender. It's like someone that comes forward with a story that they tell so that others don't make that mistake, and they get excoriated. They get completely like you're a fool, you were greedy, you're a moron. But so many of the scams that are out there, they involve these relationships where it might not even be a romance, but it's like this financial grooming where you meet a friend online, whether it's through a meetup group or through one of those texts. You develop a relationship, you develop trust, and when you develop trust, your defenses go down. And then someone starts saying, well, let me teach you about investing. Let me show you my crypto platform. And then all of a sudden you're out money. And the Wall Street Journal, CNN, USA Today, they all recently reported about just a devastatingly sad case where somebody lost a ton of his money and took his own life. So it's got serious real world consequences. So whatever you can do to help people get help is important.
Absolutely. It's great that you were able to work with them for a long time. Now, going to some more general topics. A lot of people, I hear them expressing their strong desire to hire a financial advisor to manage their money. At the same time, there are large fees that can accumulate over time from doing so. On the other hand, having a professional manage your investments and take a cut is clearly, if they're doing any kind of competent job, much better than having the money sit idle in a checking account, which, some people would do otherwise. Would love to hear your thoughts on the idea of using a financial advisor as opposed to the DIY approach for investing.
So again, as a regulator, I can't say that one is the better approach. I can't recommend any particular product or professional or strategy, but don't think of it as binary, right? It's not all in high fees and doing it myself, no fees, right? Because it's a very blurry spectrum. That, the amount of financial advice that you get along the way can vary greatly. So when you're thinking about whether you should work with a financial professional, there are a couple of key questions that you have to ask yourself. One is, who am I as an investor, right? And that might be like, I'm a risk taker, I like to manage my money, but it goes even deeper. It's like, how much money do you have, right? Those years where I was in mountains of debt, I wasn't really able to be much of an investor. I did contribute to my company's 401k and then ultimately the TSP through the federal government while I was paying off my loans. But it was one of those things where if you don't have a lot of money to invest, you probably don't want to incur high fees to manage that money, right? And if you have a lot of debt, probably want to pay off that debt, like focus on that as a key strategy, building up an emergency fund so you don't get deeper into debt along the way. But you have to know yourself as an investor. So you have to know, what is my personal balance sheet look like? What's my income? What are my expenses? What does my family situation look like, right? I mean, some of us in our 30s have children, right? Or in our 20s, we've got children. We've also got aging parents. Some of us in our 50s are first-time parents, right? Like everyone has a different profile. And so what's your profile? How much money do you have to invest? If you do have money left over, it can be a great way to get into the markets, especially if you're contributing to any retirement plan that's made available through your employer.
And there's definitely one here which
And-
everyone takes very good advantage of.
Awesome. I hope it has a good match. Yeah.
Question on advisory. Do you guys weigh in on capping like financial advisor fees or anything like that? Because that can start to get predatory when you start going further.
So there are different, so part of what's important to know, the question is, does FINRA cap the advisory fees? It's like the industry does it across the advisory and the brokerage industry. There's a competitive advantage to having lower fees for many people. There are caps on some fees, like the fees that are baked into mutual funds. Those are capped. So and that's actually a good segue to talk about, like, one of the other questions to ask is, what am I getting for whatever I'm paying for, right? Like, are you getting advice? Are you getting diversification? What are you getting? What services are you getting? And how much am I paying for it? And how am I paying for it? There are people who work with robo-advisors, which are these online advisory firms. They have a limited array of offerings, and that might be the exact right thing for someone. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but they think they're not paying any fees because there's a very minimal account opening fee that they might pay, but then they're not really paying fees for any kind of advice because the advice is built into the offering of the products, the offering of the limited array of choices so that, you can follow a broad-based strategy, basically. You're still paying fees though. Those funds that you're investing in have fees baked into them. And so how am I paying? How much am I paying? And what am I getting? Now, in that robo-advisor example, you're probably paying a very limited amount for the advice of the structure that serves you if you think you're an appropriate customer of that firm. Given, what did I talk about, right? Given your personal financial circumstances. Always want to think about your goals, think about your financial services, think about your financial circumstances. How much do I have to invest? Where do I want to invest it, right? How much risk can I take? Risk is a tricky concept because it has multiple meanings. And risk for an investor, it can be I want to go bungee jumping with my investments, right? Like, I just want to dive off a cliff. I don't care if it's an unregistered security. I've got tons of money in crypto, whatever. Like, you want to take risk, you thrive on risk. But there are some people who think, well, I like taking risk. I want to get big returns, but you can't sleep at night. It's okay if you can't sleep at night, but if you can't sleep at night, don't take that risk, right? And so it's like understanding yourself again, like even that concept of risk is understanding yourself as an investor. So going back to fees, there are zero commission trading opportunities, right? You think, all right, I'm trading on an app platform, nothing to download it. I've got my account. I don't even have to put much money into the account. I'm able to place trades in certain stocks and I don't pay a commission. Okay. However, you probably aren't getting the best execution on that trade as you could. And so it's micro pennies that you're paying, but you're paying something. You are always paying something when you're investing. It's just how you do it and how much you do it. If you're, using an app-based platform, sorry, I'm trying to make all those words into one word. You don't get advice, but you might see leaderboards or you might see recommendations, and that doesn't count. At least right now, it doesn't count as investment advice that would bring in the higher standard that brokers and advisors have to follow when they're giving recommendations to customers, which is the best interest for brokers and fiduciary for advisors. They're effectively the same standard. It's just two different laws that build them in. So you're not getting that advice. It might feel like you're getting advice. And it might feel like, well, hey, I'm able to follow my favorite person and see what's in their portfolio. And that feels like advice. But it's not the kind of advice that's regulated by FINRA. It is regulated by the SEC. So what are you getting? How much are you paying for it? And how are you paying for it? You buy a bond. A lot of people think like, oh, this is great. I'm going to be getting X% on my bond and I'm not even paying for it. Built in to the pricing and the return of that bond, there's a markup. if you're buying and a mark down if you're selling. Basically it's a percentage less than you would get, right? So it's you're still paying for it. It just doesn't feel like it. And with mutual funds, they all have cost ratios. Exchange traded funds also have costs built into the product themselves. And so you're always paying something. So we have another tool called the Fund Analyzer. If you're thinking about mutual funds or exchange traded funds, you can use the Fund Analyzer to compare fee structures. So let's say hypothetically, you want to be exposed to the top 100 companies in the United States. Well, there are a number of exchange traded funds and mutual funds out there that have compiled portfolios where they're investing assets into those top 100 companies. All kinds of issuers will create these mutual funds and exchange traded funds. They all have a slightly different expense ratio. You can look at a couple of different ones and compare to see what the impact of that difference in fees. Well, to see the impact of the fees, but then also to see what the difference over time, if you're going to be holding for 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years, a 1% difference in an expense ratio can add up to tens of thousands of dollars that you've left effectively on the table. So it's super important to think about this.
I actually did take a look at the Fund Analyzer in preparation for this meeting, and I will say, I thought it was very well put together. I'm not always impressed by things I see on these sites, but I thought that it was really well done and made it very clear.
I will pass that along to my team. They will appreciate it.
And I will second what you said about not even a percent, but even 0.1%. When you're investing $500,000, as people here either are or someday will be, I mean, that's hundreds of dollars every year. By the time you've gone through your whole life, you're easily into the tens of thousands just from 0.1%.
Exactly.
And I try to emphasize that to people constantly.
Well, and that's where like that $500,000, you know, let's say you're paying 1%, you know, for an advisory fee.
$5,000.
$5,000. So is your portfolio actively traded? Do you have a professional who is making recommendations that are providing, you know, beating the market yields? Do you feel comfortable in the diversification that they're affording to you? Do you just not want to deal with your money? And to you, it's worth it to pay that $5,000 to see even more in return. Perfectly appropriate if you say yes, and equally appropriate if you say no. But doing the math, and I'm hopeful that everyone here can do math a lot better than I can. But doing the math and understanding kind of what am I getting from what I'm giving, right? Like there are people who just, their time is money, right? The time that they can be dedicated to their research, to their business plans, to volunteering in their, you know, congregation, their church, their synagogue, their mosque, whatever it is, right? Like that is so much more worth it to them than the X% and the X dollars that they're paying to a financial professional. It's a totally personal decision.
I want to pause and just ask a show of hands. How many people have questions? Let's go ahead. Okay, let's go ahead and take questions. I had a couple others, but I want to get your guys' questions instead. Before we do start that, I'm going to say what I said already one more time. Which is that we are making a record of this. So if you speak out loud, you are consenting to be captured. If you don't consent and you want to ask a question, we have a paper and a pen over there so you can write it down and I will ask on your behalf. So who would like to ask a question? Yes.
So if you kind of look at your financial background and decided that you want to deal with a financial advisor, could you kind of talk to maybe a framework to try to find one? And I would like even say maybe you want to deal with a fee-only financial advisor and one that does not charge an advisory fee. So, you know, you cut a check for $1,500 a year for a meeting a month or a meeting every month. Just a framework about how to find somebody.
Sure. So there are professional organizations that are dedicated to fee-only financial planners, and they have mechanisms, search tools. It's often based on the credential that they hold. And we have another tool. It's probably less spiffy. You probably won't like it as much, but it's a professional designations database so that you can take a look at the database, just type in whatever it is, XYZ credential, and you can see whether, you know, who the issuing organization is and like whether there's ongoing continuing education for people who hold this credential, whether they have to abide by a code of ethics, right? Because some credentials are very, very rigorous. It takes years to attain them. And others are basically play around a golf, you know, at a resort one weekend and all of a sudden you're a senior super something. So there are organizations, but it's always a good idea to come back to BrokerCheck, to do a search, to see whether they've had a history of run-ins with regulators and whether they're an investment advisor or a broker. If they are either giving investment advice for a fee that's customized, or they are selling securities, they will be in BrokerCheck. There are very few exceptions, and one of the few exceptions at a state level has actually been closed. So now there are investment professionals who don't give tailored advice, who give you kind of general portfolio guidance. And again, think about what you're paying them, but find out whether, like, you might be using them for the only element, but they might also be investment advisors who are registered. You just want to know them. Doesn't make them a good person or a bad person, but it means that you shouldn't be surprised if at some point they start steering you toward their platform. And I'll just say personally, I experienced that in my life where I hired someone to do a financial plan, and it was a fantastic financial plan, but the person said, hey, I can also help manage. It's like, no, thank you. You know, at that point I wasn't doing it myself. And, you know, I now do both. So I have an investment advisor who I checked out thoroughly on BrokerCheck. And I also do my own investing. So it's on the FINRA website. If you go to finra.org/BrokerCheck, but if you just Google BrokerCheck, it should be one of the first things that come up. I think you could even get there by going to brokercheck.org because it takes you to the FINRA website. And it can be a little overwhelming the first time you go there, but the decoding of it is if you put in Gerri Walsh, I think you won't find anybody. But if you put in, I can't remember his last name, but it was one of my colleagues' uncles who, his name was Igorin, and he ended up getting kicked out of the industry. He now shows up in sort of red ink on BrokerCheck. So if you see red or pink, bad sign. But someone who shows up in blue is currently registered, and you'll see what their registrations are. You can see what licenses they have. And if someone used to be registered, they'll show up in gray. And there'll be an indication, a disclosure indication that they have a record. That means that they had arbitrations against them or customer complaints. Doesn't necessarily mean that the customer complaint was resolved in favor of the customer. For brokers, they actually, you know, one of the things that I know frustrates a lot of them is that customer complaints can linger on their records, and, you know, make them look like bad brokers. Vast majority of investment professionals have no claims against them, because they make money when you make money, and they don't really survive in the industry if they're taking the money. But it's really a good idea to look them up.
Do we have a follow-up over here?
Follow up on that. So let's provide a certification or something to financial advisors. For example, I've been interviewing financial advisors, and they all say we are fiduciary, we are certified financial planning, et cetera. Enforcing the term FINRA associated with that. Is there any certification that your organization provides?
So the question is there a certification that FINRA provides? And, you know, FINRA does the licensing exams. So there are licenses that brokers have to be like a general securities representative, to be supervisory. There are some investment professionals who only sell like variable annuities and insurance products, who have their Series 6. Or they only work with mutual fund sales, or exchange traded funds through one of the, you know, large platforms. and they will have a Series 6. Some only sell municipal securities, right? They have I think 24. So there are different licenses that we have, but there are a number of states who allow individuals who are like a CFP or which is the certified financial planner, the chartered financial analyst. There's 3 other designations that they're allowed to be an investment advisor in that state without actually having to take any kind of licensing exam. And, you know, those exams have been determined to be rigorous exams. So depending on the kind of business that they're operating, they might be registered with their state. If they have more than $110 million in assets under management, they'll be registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission and will absolutely show up in broker check. They should show up in broker check for the state. And then there's the brokers. And so all 3 of those buckets show up in broker check so that you can see what their history is. The difference between, like we often get this sort of like, well, should I only work with a fiduciary? And again, I can't answer that question. But fiduciaries are governed by a combination of state and laws that the SEC enforces that set a fiduciary standard, which is basically a standard of care. That standard says you, as a fiduciary, have to put the best interests of the customer ahead of your own. To level the playing field and really to raise the standard on brokers, several years ago, I believe it was in 2020 that it went into effect, the SEC put into place best interest, regulation best interest, sometimes called Reg BI. And that sets a duty of care that is equivalent to the fiduciary standard, but it is not titled fiduciary, and brokers are not allowed to use the word fiduciary. So there are some firms that market themselves as fiduciaries in a way that is 100% appropriate. And there are firms that market themselves as fiduciaries that could be potentially misleading. And it's probably worth kind of taking a look at the firm and the people. You know, I think it's really whatever, if you're getting advice from a broker or an investment advisor, you want that to be in your best interest, right? Not in the best interest of the firm. And so you want to look at the record of the person that you're working with. You want to know how much they charge. You want to know whether they're limited in the products that they can sell to you, right? Because if you want to have a diversified portfolio, and for most of us, having a diversified portfolio is one of the least expensive, most effective ways to manage our risk, right? We don't have all our eggs in one basket. You want to make sure that if they can only sell a certain type of product and you have $1 million, right? They're going to put, a lot of them are like, even though they're fiduciaries, they're going to put that money in their products. And so, you know, an example of like, well, how do you work with people like me? You know, that kind of question. And you know, they might only sell insurance products, but who do you recommend for, you know, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, right? Like you want to dig deep to make sure that that fiduciary is really acting in your best interest.
It's not always transparent.
And you know, it's kind of like Madoff. Everybody, you know, has a clean record until they don't. The reality is most investment professionals don't. I don't want to scare people away from investment professionals. But you definitely want to do that background. And your state securities regulator can always help. Here in Maryland, the state securities regulator is very active. They're an office within the Office of the Attorney General.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but I don't want Josh to feel neglected. So Josh, why don't you give us the last question of the day?
Sure, yeah. So I was just wondering, maybe on the financial education side of your work. I know a lot of us have probably heard news about GameStop and meme stock craze. And on one hand, that's bringing a lot of people who didn't really think about finances into the financial world and getting them exposed to that. But on the other hand, people are getting advice from social media where that might not be their best interest at heart. I'm just curious, what's your thought on has the meme stock craze been a positive or negative for financial education?
So it's interesting because we know that younger, from the research that we're doing, we know that particularly younger investors, but novice investors writ large, so even people who are just starting to invest, say in their forties, are getting their information from social media. With Gen Z in particular, they don't necessarily trust it, but it's one of the sources of information that they use. So, my personal opinion is that anything that gets information into people's hands can be a good thing, but I emphasize can because there's a lot of dis and misinformation out there. There are a lot of well-intended financial influencers, which we call finfluencers, out there dispensing advice that, it has no grounding in reality, like literally wrong stuff. And unless the broker dealer is using that social media influencer to, kind of cultivate relationships for the firm, we don't have jurisdiction, but states and the SEC do. And there have been actions taken against not so prominent and prominent people who are making recommendations. I mean, Kim Kardashian got fined $1.2 million for failing to disclose that she was getting paid by a crypto company to recommend a crypto trading platform. So, the meme stock, the 2020 sort of phenomenon of the meme stock craze, which actually was more 2021. But during COVID, people had money because they got stimulus checks. Gaming was shut down. There wasn't gambling. There wasn't sports betting, right? Because there wasn't any sports. There weren't horse races. There weren't, like, all the things that people bet on was gone in that first few months of 2020. And so a lot of people got into the markets. The interesting thing is about 75% of those new investors stayed in the markets. And the ones who said that they were getting into the markets to learn about investing actually improved their financial knowledge. And the folks, 2 years later, we did a longitudinal study. The folks who said, yeah, just kind of got into the market, I wanted to learn about investing, their scores were higher and they were more likely to use a financial professional or to have a way of getting financial advice. So it's really interesting to see those dynamics. App-based platforms, you can love them, you can hate them. The reality is they have made it cheaper and easier for more Americans to invest. You don't have to go into a brick and mortar shop, right? You don't have to find a brick and mortar shop. You're able to trade on your phone, online, and you're just able to do so at much lower margins than ever before. So I kind of personally love the fact that there's all this information out there. I worry that it's very difficult to tell the difference between truth and reality. And going back to AI, just because I know that this might be of interest to y'all, but probably 2 weeks ago, maybe last week, we did a kind of quick hit survey with about 1,000 investors, and we did an experiment where we surveyed sort of their financial knowledge and attitudes toward investing. But then we also did an experiment where half of them were told, they were given 4 financial statements, and they were told that it came from a financial professional. And we did an assessment of their trust. But those same questions were asked of a control group that was told this was provided by AI. And the humans won for now. In housing, it was a little bit closer. With investment portfolio allocation, there was much more of a desire to deal with a human being rather than an AI bot. But it was fascinating. And it's something that we as a regulator are keeping an eye on because all these changes in the market have implications for the market.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are all out of time, but you may have noticed Jerry's been drinking from a perfectly serviceable hydro flask over here, but it's not the best way you could possibly be drinking water. So we're gonna give you this nice little Johns Hopkins mug, so you can drink your water in this as a very small token of our appreciation for you coming out to see us.
And it is water, right? It is water. Just in case you wondered. Thank you. It was a pleasure to spend the afternoon with you.
So let's all give Jerry one more round of applause for coming out to visit us.
This is awesome.